This is a hall of glory, where paintings and displays commemorate American military achievements. Ghosts walk here, their muffled tread keeping step to the drum roll of history. Ghosts walk these halls whose bodies sleep at Shiloh, and by vineyards at Chateau Thierry, and beneath coral beaches on islands burning in the sun. And in their company, the spirits of men still living, their manhood reached in flame and smoke somewhere in a German forest, a choked Pacific jungle, in the skies over Korea, or on a carrier in the Pacific. They all assemble here, the spirits of men still living and men long dead, for an eternal roll call. You seem to hear it as you stand here, the long, sweet voice of bugles whose echoes reach that part of men where pride stirs. And through those haunting echoes, you hear the call that never ceases. Bravery, bravery, bravery. And the answers return, here, sir, here, sir, here, sir. 7 medals, symbols lustered with the gleam of gallantry, form a pyramid of honor in the military service. The Purple Heart is for wounds received in action against an enemy. For heroic or meritorious achievement or service against an enemy not involving aerial flight, the Bronze Star. For heroism not involving actual conflict with an enemy, the Soldier's Medal. For heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in actual flight, the Distinguished Flying Cross. For gallantry in action, the Silver Star. For extraordinary heroism in military operations against an armed enemy, the Distinguished Service Cross. And at the pinnacle of the pyramid, for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life, above and beyond the call of duty, the Medal of Honor. Gallantry, intrepidity, beyond the call.
Man is a faltering animal. He weeps, he bleeds, he falls and fails and feeds on the insubstantial stuff of dreams. But there's also a nobility in him. A clean, hard gem of splendor, packed into the frail clay by the hand of God. The source of those virtues which are his special glory and which enable him to raise his eyes to the stars even when his feet are in the mud. Such a virtue is his power to love. Such is his knowledge of beauty. Such
is his courage.
Men, in their tribes and the societies they've built, in their homes and nation states and in their armies, have always honored courage when they found it among their own. For this quality, courage, bravery, whatever name we call it by, is the royal virtue. And men, when they see it, glimpse the nobility of their line. In its reflected glow, all men are kings. History gave us, as a nation, particular reason to prize this virtue when it imposed upon us its special challenge to win independence in a test of fire.
With our independence won, history challenged us to build a society in which men of many creeds and races could govern themselves freely. Before the process of building was completed, we were forced to defend our splendid proposition in the most searing of all tests, a war facing brother with brother. with the scars of that conflict still bleeding, we had to extend the nation's boundaries and secure its frontiers. But even this was not enough, for history was pushing fast upon us. Scarcely as time moves had all this been done when the modern world dawned with its shrinking distances and overlapping interests. And we were obliged first to take our rightful place in it, and then, as shadows began to rise from the tomb of man's darkest past, to assume leadership among the free nations of the earth.
All this in less than 2 centuries. A faint-hearted people couldn't have done it. It's no wonder, then, that we celebrate the bravery of the giants in our midst. And those who won this medal, the Medal of Honor, are the bravest of the brave. The Medal of Honor is now a century old. It was created by Congress in 1862. But it was built on a record of American heroism on the field of combat, which even then was generations old. Beginning with the embattled farmers who stood at Bunker Hill and wrote the word patriot in steel and smoke on the emerging mind of a young nation. Beginning there, brave men carried the American dream in their stout hearts and fought for it and died for it. In every test of strength and will our nation faced in its first century. And because of them, we passed imperceptibly from the status of a noble experiment to that of a force in being. Now, they were unsung, most of these early heroes. Their deeds are the golden thread with which our history is stitched, but no medals were forged in their name or their honor. We were still rebelling in those days of our lusty youth against our old world heritage. And medals, we thought, were the trappings of Europe's armies, not those of a young democracy. But before that first century was over, came the conflict which shook this nation to its fundamentals and marked in deep suffering the beginning of its maturity.
The Civil War. So nobly conceived, so proudly constructed, the American Union now lay bleeding and perhaps dying. Searching in its agony for the promise of its future, it found itself looking into the eyes of its sons. For here now, more than anywhere else, lay the meaning and the hope of the American experience. The longings, the fears, and the loneliness of a boy growing suddenly to manhood were a reflection of the nation's own anguish, as both, soldier and nation together, tensed and waited for the test of fire to come. The nation had shaped the man, and now, in a moment of historic crisis, the man carried whatever hope existed for the nation's continued life. Whether the Union endured would depend heavily on his personal faith in the Union's cause and his ability to prove that faith in the most demanding of all tests. He fought with courage, and a grateful people in the midst of war forged a medal to honor that courage. In the swirling fury of battlefields which scored the American heart, the Medal of Honor was born. The first actual award to any service was given to soldiers on March 25, 1863. In the century of its existence, 3,156 officers and enlisted men of all services have won the Medal of Honor. About half of these awards memorialize exploits of the Civil War, which in many ways was the most personal of all the nation's wars. Not only did American face American as enemies, but they fought in man-to-man engagements. The ratio of casualties in battle to total numbers of men engaged was higher than any other war.
The Civil War was deeply felt by both sides. The cause to each was sacred. Bravery wore a gray uniform as well as blue. But in the perspective of history, the preservation of the Union was the greater cause, and the Medals of Honor awarded to the Army, Navy, and Marines in that war are testaments to brave deeds which gave us the Union forever. In the war of its birth, the Medal of Honor was the only award for gallantry in action. Later, other medals would be created to commemorate bravery in all its forms. And in the process of this distillation, the Medal of Honor would emerge as the supreme award, earned only by gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. With the tragic war over, the nation took up the heavy task of binding its wounds. The guns of the big war were silent now, but on the western frontier, the fires of another kind of war still flamed.
Charged with the task of making the frontier safe was the regular army. Out west, that meant the cavalry. The enemy was no soldier in gray now, but a bronzed warrior in buckskin, lashing out suddenly against a beleaguered stockade. In the hot and dusty Arizona sun, in the biting, freezing Nebraska snows, into the face of danger hundreds of times the cavalry rode. Rugged, leather-skinned soldiers on horseback, in their defense of the frontier, they bore the brunt of the attacks of hostile tribes. Many men who fought their lonely battles and died their lonely deaths in this distant America which has passed into legend won medals of honor. The names of their battlegrounds are obscure now, most of them, but some still ring in our national memory and always will. Names like Little Bighorn, where saber-wielding cavalrymen, outnumbered but not outfought, went down under the onslaught of the Indian charge. In the hard, grinding years of the Indian Wars, 415 Army men who fought America's battles on those distant plains were to receive the Medal of Honor. Not all of these heroes lived to hear about it, but for those who came after, their names have passed into golden legend.
It's 1898 now, the century of consolidation, of cataclysmic change, of division and reaffirmation is drawing to a close. The nation hears the first faint echoes of history's insistence that it look beyond its own shores and take its place in the world at large. In Cuba, Havana Harbor is shaken by an enormous explosion, one whose thundering reverberations sound from shore to shore in our land. The explosion is caused by the sinking of the United States battleship Maine, sent to Cuba to protect Americans during the Cuban battle for liberty against Spain. The cry, "Remember the Maine," sweeps the nation. And none shouted it louder and a band of rugged men called the Rough Riders.
Led by Theodore Roosevelt, they were to be in the vanguard of the force to land in Cuba as allies of the Cuban people against their Spanish rulers. Roosevelt and Colonel Leonard Wood recruited about 1,000 men who were to be good shots and good riders. And a tough and hardy lot they were. Their greatest day was July 1st, 1898. Their objective was a crucial hill in enemy hands. To reach it, they had to advance under deadly fire every bit of the way. But they made it to the top. And history recorded the charge up San Juan Hill as one of its most stirring chapters of courage in combat. 30 Army men were to be paid our nation's highest tribute in that short but fiercely fought war. Together with 81 Navy and Marine fighting men, they were the first to win medals of honor on foreign soil.
The Spanish-American War wouldn't be the last time America's soldiers would fight on land far removed from their own. The end of that war brought international responsibilities, and over the years, these responsibilities would grow. And an America which had believed it could lock its interests behind its own frontiers would be shocked into an awareness that trouble in a faraway place might well signal a new challenge for American troops. We who live in this tense and global day have learned to live with that idea. But to those of an earlier time, suspicious of foreign entanglements and foreign adventures, the idea was shattering.
Consider, for instance, the shock to America in the first year of the new century, when it found that developments in far-off China called for the presence, the fighting presence, of United States troops. Thousands of fanatical Chinese laid siege to foreign embassies in the capital city of Peking.
As engagements go, the Boxer Rebellion was a minor one. It occupies little more than a footnote in our military history. But brave men fought there, and some of them won the Medal of Honor. And of these winners, one man's courageous action has come down through the years as a symbol of the kind of courage which the bravest of the brave have displayed in all wars. He was a bugler with an infantry regiment. The Americans and other forces trying to relieve the besieged embassies were blocked by a 30-foot wall. The bugler's company commander called for a volunteer to scale the wall. And the young soldier's ringing response, "I'll try, sir," has become an example of high courage and an inspiration to infantrymen ever since.
In the victory parade which followed the crushing of the Boxer Rebellion, Americans took their place proudly. And the world saw for the first time what in a later day it would see repeated many times over. United States troops marching shoulder to shoulder in victory with the forces of other nations. Scarcely a decade after the Boxer Rebellion, United States Army soldiers were riding through the dry desert dust south of the Mexican border. A Mexican bandit named Pancho Villa had stirred up deep trouble by destroying American lives and property. An American expeditionary force had been sent in to eliminate the trouble. Although none could know it at the time, this campaign would see the last great charge ever made by American cavalry. Riding, unaware of the place they would hold in cavalry history, into the teeth of the danger that lay waiting.
One man was awarded the Medal of Honor in this campaign. One man. Always it's been America's fortune to have that man, that member of a special breed who served beyond the call, there at the moment he's needed. But if the nation had felt the need of him up to this time, as certainly it had, it could hardly face the challenges that lay ahead without him. For now, the door to the new world, the world we live in today, was opening wide. And events beyond our control, but not beyond our interests, were driving us irrevocably into it. The shape of this world would be determined largely on fields of battle, reluctantly but inevitably. For now, we could do no other. We would take our position on those fields far removed from the American continent and prove, in the sacrifice demanded of us by history, our greatness as a nation in a world of mighty nations. In the doing, we would call, as always, on the bravery of American sons. And from those blessed few, the bravest of the brave, we would gain the privilege to look again into the face of cold and perfect courage, the kind that's performed above and beyond the call of duty. What is courage? Men in many times and many circumstances have sought to define it, as if by doing so they could crystallize its hard and special beauty. America's revered man of letters, Mark Twain, once called courage resistance to fear. A man somewhat closer to our own time and a warrior refined it a little further. Courage, he said, is fear holding on a minute longer. His name was General George S. Patton. Certainly, courage is not exclusively a military quality, but its military associations go deep. For the battlefield intensifies and strips to their fundamentals the toughest challenges that life can impose. For a man just to live in its environment and do his job well demands a measure of this royal virtue, which few men are called upon to display in their lives. Acts which stand out then in this atmosphere of constant bravery glow with a special quality. The medals with which the nation honors its military brave are each in its own way tributes to this virtue. And at the summit of the pyramid which these medals form, the highest award the nation can give, the Medal of Honor. The war America entered in 1917 was a new kind of war.
The truck and the tank and the machine gun had come, and combat was never to be the same again. The war that lay waiting for the doughboy was one of massed firepower, and long trench lines facing each other across the graveyard of a no-man's land. Americans fought beside their European allies in the Great War, but they fought as integral American units. And they fought a vigorous offensive, an offensive of small units sweeping through heavily fortified German defenses in almost a suicidal way. What kind of face does courage wear in such a war? The one it has always worn. For the face of courage does not change, however much the weapons change with which the courageous man fights, or the tactics and techniques of the battle he wages. In World War I, that special courage, the kind summoned by the man who takes his life in his hands to do what must be done above and beyond the call of duty, wore the faces of 95 brave men. Among them, the private who silenced 4 machine gun positions and was killed while storming the 5th alone. The captain, who was cut down by machine gun fire while leading his company in an assault on a heavily defended position and continued forward on a stretcher. The corporal, who made it possible for his unit to press its attack despite hostile fire by rushing a machine gun nest alone and beating off the enemy with his bayonet. And the legendary sergeant from Tennessee, whose daring assault on an enemy position brought in 132 prisoners. Courage in battle did find a new proving ground in World War I, the air. The airplane had barely emerged from its status as an interesting experiment, and now it was a formidable weapon of war. And the ranks of Medal of Honor winners, men who had fought on land and sea, were increased by men who wrote their records of bravery in the sky. By men such as the flying lieutenant from Ohio, who attacked 7 enemy planes, shot down 2 of them, and scattered the rest on the eve of the Argonne offensive.
World War I, with its particular call on bravery, in a kind of war new to the world at that time, saw the introduction of the airplane in combat. Scarcely a generation later, a Second World War, which would make demands on more men than ever in the nation's history, came to America on the wings of the same machine. Now a highly developed weapon of destruction.
The war began in explosions, in chaos, in devastation, in defeat. 14 million Americans responded by training for the greatest and most destructive war in history. 430 of them would earn the right to wear the Medal of Honor. Americans earned their Medals of Honor in virtually every spot on the globe where Americans fought. And how would each man win it? Bravely. Bravely. By standing for a moment in time alone. Lighted by a fire which rages in all men, but lights in a special few in special times, the will to break the prison locks of fear and concern for self, and do, at whatever cost, the job at hand. Who was he? The man who served above and beyond the call of duty in World War II. He was a Marine from Ohio, a private first class serving on Guadalcanal. His machine gun emplacement took the full brunt of an all-out assault. His orders were, hold the position. All through the night, he held off the Japanese. Weary and exhausted, toward morning, he did not see an enemy soldier approach until too late. He leaped up, absorbed the violence in his own body, and yielded up his life. He was an Army lieutenant from Rhode Island who led his men toward a bunker on an enemy-held hill in Italy. His men covered him as he advanced alone and threw phosphorus grenades into the enemy's position. As the defenders emerged, he shot them. And he led his men forward to break through the enemy line. He was a platoon leader whose platoon was pinned down by Germans blocking an American advance. Ordering his men to cover him, he went forward alone and destroyed the enemy's stronghold. When his job was done, he brought his men forward, and in the process, memorialized the heroic stance of leadership wherever men fight. He was a naval officer, commander of a submarine coordinated attack group off Truk Island. He alone of the group possessed secret intelligence information of our submarine strategy. He carried out his secret orders, and the enemy paid dearly. Then, all at once, his own flag submarine was rocked and battered by Japanese depth charges. The damage was soon beyond repair. The commander decided to surface the flagship and engage the enemy in a gunfight so the men might have a chance to abandon ship and live. But for himself, the decision he made was considerably different. Rather than risk capture and possibly reveal secret plans under enemy torture or use of drugs, he decided that he would remain aboard the vessel. He would stay with it in its final plunge to the bottom. He was an Army lieutenant from Texas. When his company was attacked by tanks and enemy infantry, he ordered his men to withdraw to prepared positions. But he remained forward to direct artillery fire and to man a machine gun on a crippled tank destroyer. Later, he made his way to his company, refused medical attention for a leg wound, and organized the company in a counterattack. His counterattack pressed forward in the face of withering enemy fire. His citation read, "His indomitable courage and his refusal to give an inch of ground saved his company from possible encirclement and destruction." Indomitable courage. Other brave men rallied to its call, and the counterattack was successful. The Germans were forced to withdraw. He was a major in the Air Corps, lead pilot of a flight of 2 fighter planes, taking on the task of attacking 13 Japanese planes. Closing on the enemy formation in a climbing turn, he scored hits on the lead plane, then diving to 300 feet in pursuit of another fighter, he caught it with his initial burst. Before the action was over, 7 enemy aircraft would go down under his smoking guns. He was a general of the Army who sent a thrill through the Allied world by returning victorious, as he had promised, to a land he had been forced to withdraw from in the face of overwhelming forces. His Medal of Honor cited him for gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty in action against invading Japanese forces, and for conspicuous leadership in preparing the Philippine Islands to resist conquest. He was a flying colonel who was promoted to brigadier general on the completion of his mission. That mission, for which he volunteered and which would bring him a Medal of Honor, began as an experiment which in 1942 seemed incredible to many. An effort to lift a heavy Army bomber from the deck of a Navy aircraft carrier. These planes were destined for Japan, and the Army then had no suitable airfields close enough for them to leave from. The test was successful. Soon thereafter, from a carrier moving through the Pacific as close to Japan as possible, Army bombers manned by volunteers lurched forward. In those dark early months of the war, their mission, when it became known, would electrify the country with a thrill of hope and pride. They were to carry the war to the enemy, to a confident Tokyo which then believed itself invulnerable to attack. So audacious was the mission, so daring in conception and performance, the Japanese defenders were caught by complete surprise. The attackers came roaring in over the Japanese mainland. And first blood, the first of much to follow, was drawn from the enemy. Some of the volunteers on this mission fell into enemy hands. Some perished in the sea. Some made it to safety. One who did was the colonel, now a general, who led the mission and won the Medal of Honor. Not many general officers did win the coveted medal. The soldier who faces the enemy daily has a greater opportunity to earn it. But the value placed on it by every rank is that of the most prized of all awards. One general who did not receive it said years after the war, "I would rather have the right to wear this than be President of the United States." His name was Dwight D. Eisenhower. It's meaningless to talk of the Medal of Honor in terms of rank. Generals can win it, and corporals can win it, and cooks, and Marines, and ordinary seamen, and men who fight their battles in the sky. Bravery knows no rank. And it knows no station. The medal can be and has been won by every kind of man our society has produced. It can be won in wars of all kinds, as it has been in our time. From the mighty epic of a war that stretched across the world to one localized on the narrow peninsula of Korea. In the hills of this divided and far-off land, Americans faced communist guns for the first time. Korea was a war of symbols. It was freedom itself which was attacked, and it was in the cause of freedom that men stood and fought. But behind the symbols, it was a war of flesh and steel. The fighting was bitter and intense. 131 Americans who fought here joined the select ranks of the bravest of the brave. Some fell, some lived. Some understood clearly the contribution to freedom's defense they made. Others perhaps saw the issue dimly. But each of them reached the summit of America's pyramid of honor by a supreme act of bravery above and beyond the call.
the Korean armistice, the guns of Americans in war were silenced. The last brave deed in combat was recorded. And thus, in a sense, the story of the Medal of Honor to this day is closed. The heroic adventures of the 3,156 who have won it in a century of wars are preserved between the bindings of official histories, and all are woven into the living legend of a people and a people's spirit. But for this very reason, the story of the Medal of Honor is not ended, and indeed cannot end. But the particular essence of the medal is not what it is, or even the epic tales of those who've earned it, but more than anything else, what it represents. That precious quality which Lincoln called devotion, transformed in an atmosphere of danger into a courage whose presence ennobles man. Such a quality does not die. It lives unflowered and unseen. But if it's needed, it's there. Once more, America stands in crisis. And as in other days, searching for the promise of its future, it finds itself looking into the eyes of its sons.
Their defense of freedom is a silent one, but most solidly real. Their mission, urgent in the eyes of mankind, demands more of patience and skill, of effort and adjustment and quiet determination than it does of courage. They train so that war, with its special call for bravery, will never come. But the seeds of bravery lie there, and they will blossom if they must, in fields where they have grown before, where they have always grown, in the stout hearts of men. The links in the soldier's tradition are strong ones, and the heritage of those who serve today reaches far. And most prized of all in this heritage is the tradition of courage, refined into the special quality whose presence is felt here in this hall of glory, where ghosts of heroes walk, keeping vigil on a nation's pride.